In the depths of space, where silence reigns supreme, and stars whisper ancient secrets, trust is the rarest currency. For Zara Keth-6, a brilliant Veltar engineer whose crystalline blue skin bore the scars of humanity's broken promises, humans were nothing more than a plague upon the galaxy. They took what they wanted, destroyed what they couldn't understand, and left devastation in their wake. She had witnessed their cruelty firsthand, felt the sting of their betrayal burn deep into her soul. But when the mining station Kepler-7 becomes a tomb floating in the void, and escape pods malfunction one by one, Zara finds herself trapped with the very species she despises. As oxygen runs thin and hope fades like dying starlight, an unlikely human stranger makes a choice that will shatter everything she believed about his kind. Sometimes, the greatest enemy can become the most unexpected savior. And sometimes, survival demands we confront the prejudices that have shaped our hearts. This is a story of redemption written in the language of sacrifice, where the darkness between worlds becomes the canvas for humanity's true nature to shine through. When all seems lost, will one human's selfless act be enough to bridge the chasm of distrust that separates two species? The answer lies in the cold embrace of space, where heroes are born not from strength, but from the willingness to risk everything for those who see us as monsters. The emergency klaxon screamed through the corridors of mining station Kepler-7 like the dying breath of some metallic beast. Zara Keth-6 pressed her crystalline blue hands against the thrumming walls, feeling the station's death throes vibrate through her sensitive fingertips. The Veltar woman's large, luminous eyes reflected the strobing red emergency lights as she moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency, her mind already calculating survival probabilities. She had been here for 3 months, overseeing the installation of new atmospheric processors in the deepest sections of the station. It was supposed to be routine work, the kind that paid well, and kept her away from human colonies where the stares and whispered comments followed her like shadows. The Veltar were still relatively new to the galactic community, their homeworld only discovered 50 years ago, and humans seemed to view them with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. Zara preferred the suspicion. It meant they kept their distance. The station shuddered violently, and somewhere in the distance, she heard the distinctive whine of hull plating beginning to fail. Whatever had gone wrong in the mining operation below had triggered a cascade failure that was tearing Kepler-7 apart from the inside. Through the transparent aluminum viewports, she could see debris floating past in lazy spirals, pieces of the lower mining decks that had already been jettisoned into the void. Her communicator crackled to life with the panicked voice of Station Commander Harris. All personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat. All personnel to emergency stations. Prepare for immediate evacuation. Zara's jaw tightened. She had heard promises like that before. When the human corporations had first arrived on Veltar Prime, they had promised partnership, mutual benefit, and respect for her people's ancient crystal gardens. Instead, they had strip-mined entire continents, poisoned the singing stones that her ancestors had cultivated for millennia, and left her world scarred and gasping. Her family had been among the first to trust the humans. Her father, a respected crystal singer, had welcomed them with open arms and an open mind. He had died 3 years later from exposure to human industrial toxins, his voice forever silenced, his crystals turned to ash. That was when Zara learned her first hard lesson about humanity. Their words were as empty as the space between stars. The station lurched again, more violently this time, and Zara knew she was running out of time. She sprinted toward the nearest emergency station, her long legs carrying her swiftly through corridors that were rapidly filling with smoke and the acrid smell of burning electronics. Other workers rushed past her, their faces twisted with terror, but none of them were Veltar. She was alone here, just as she had been alone everywhere else she had traveled in human space. The emergency station was in chaos when she arrived. Humans scrambled around the escape pod bays, their voices raised in panic and confusion. Commander Harris stood at the central console, his face pale and drawn as he coordinated the evacuation. Zara approached him with measured steps, keeping her expression carefully neutral. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying the distinctive harmonic undertones of her species. "What is our situation?" Harris looked up, his eyes widening slightly as they took in her alien features. "Engineer Keth-6. Good. We need every technical specialist we can get." He gestured toward the status board, which was awash in angry red indicators. "We've lost primary power to the lower decks. The mining laser array overloaded and triggered a cascade failure in the reactor core. We have maybe 30 minutes before the station breaks apart completely." Zara studied the readouts with professional detachment. The situation was worse than Harris was letting on. The containment fields around the reactor were fluctuating wildly, and the structural integrity of the station's main support pylons was degrading faster than the computers could compensate. They had perhaps 15 minutes, not 30. "The escape pods?" she asked. "That's our problem," Harris said, running a hand through his graying hair. "We've lost 7 pods to system failures, and 3 more are showing critical malfunctions. We have 43 people on this station, and only 12 functioning escape pods." Zara felt a familiar chill settle in her chest. Of course, even in a crisis, the universe seemed determined to remind her why trusting humans was a mistake. She had no doubt that if it came down to choosing who would get the remaining pods, the alien engineer would not be high on their priority list. A young human technician rushed up to Harris, his face flushed with exertion. "Sir, we've managed to restore power to Pod 7, but it's showing atmospheric leaks. The life support system is compromised." "How compromised?" Harris asked. 12 hours of air, maybe 14 if we're lucky." Harris nodded grimly. "Better than nothing. Add it to the functional list." Zara watched the exchange with growing unease. The nearest rescue ships were at least 18 hours away, according to the last communication she had intercepted. A pod with 12 hours of life support was essentially a coffin that would take slightly longer to kill its occupants. The station groaned around them, the sound of metal being twisted beyond its limits. Through the chaos, Zara heard someone calling for volunteers to help with the evacuation coordination. She was about to turn away when she noticed a human male standing apart from the others, watching the proceedings with what looked like professional calm. He was tall and lean, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in hostile environments. Unlike the others, he wasn't pushing toward the front of the evacuation queue or arguing about pod assignments. Instead, he seemed to be studying the technical readouts with the same analytical approach that Zara herself would use. Their eyes met for a moment across the crowded bay, and Zara felt a flicker of something. Recognition, perhaps, of a kindred spirit who understood that panic was the enemy of survival. Then, the moment passed, and she turned her attention back to the evacuation proceedings. "Listen up, everyone," Harris called out, his voice cutting through the noise. "We're going to do this in an orderly fashion. Priority goes to non-essential personnel first, then technical staff, then senior officers. Each pod has been assigned a pilot and a backup pilot." Zara noticed that her name was not called among the early evacuees. She was not surprised. As one of only 3 technical specialists on the station, she would likely be among the last to leave, if she left at all. The irony was not lost on her. The humans might distrust her kind, but when their lives were on the line, they still expected her expertise to save them. The first wave of evacuees began boarding their assigned pods. Zara watched as families were separated, as friends said hurried goodbyes, as the fundamental inequality of emergency evacuation played out in real time. She found herself thinking of her father, of the promises that had been made and broken, of all the ways that humans had proven themselves unworthy of trust. A hand touched her shoulder, and she spun around, her reflexes sharp from years of living among those who saw her as different. It was the calm human male she had noticed earlier. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a deep brown, intelligent, and alert. "You're the Veltar engineer," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Zara replied, her voice carefully neutral. "And you are?" "Marcus Chun, xenobiology specialist. I've been studying the mineral compositions in the lower mining levels." He paused, glancing around at the chaos surrounding them. "I wanted to thank you." Zara blinked, her large eyes narrowing slightly. "Thank me? For what?" "Your atmospheric processor modifications. I reviewed your work when I arrived last month. Brilliant engineering. You increased efficiency by 30% while reducing the environmental impact by half. If more humans understood Veltar crystal resonance technology." He trailed off as another shudder ran through the station. Zara stared at him, momentarily speechless. In all her time working in human space, no one had ever bothered to actually study her work, much less understand its underlying principles. "You studied Veltar technology?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "I wrote my doctoral thesis on crystalline matrix structures in non-terrestrial environments. Your people's understanding of harmonic resonance is centuries ahead of anything we've developed." Before Zara could respond, an explosion rocked the station, more violent than any that had come before. The lights flickered and died, leaving them in the eerie glow of emergency illumination. When they came back online, alarms were screaming from every direction. "Hull breach in Section 7, someone shouted. "We're losing atmosphere fast." Harris's voice cut through the panic. "All remaining personnel, immediate evacuation. No exceptions. Move, people move." The remaining evacuees surged toward the escape pods with renewed urgency. Zara found herself swept along in the crowd, Marcus Chin beside her as they were pushed toward Pod 13. The small craft was already crowded with 8 other people, their faces pale and frightened in the harsh lighting. As they approached the pod, Zara noticed something that made her blood freeze. The atmospheric integrity indicator was flashing yellow, and the life support diagnostics showed critical system warnings. This was one of the compromised pods, one of the ones with only 12 hours of air. "Wait," she called out to the pod coordinator. "This unit has been classified as critically compromised." The coordinator, a harried-looking human woman, barely glanced up from her checklist. "It's all we have left. Get in." Zara hesitated. 12 hours in space, waiting for rescue that might not come in time. It was a gamble with odds that no rational being would accept. Around her, the other evacuees were climbing into the pod, too panicked to understand what the warning indicators meant. Marcus Chin paused beside her. "The life support is failing," he said quietly. "Yes," Zara replied. 12 hours, perhaps less if the recycling systems degrade further. They looked at each other for a long moment. Around them, the station continued its death song, metal groaning and twisting as the fundamental forces that held it together began to fail. The choice was simple: board a pod that would likely become their tomb, or remain on a station that was definitely going to be their grave. "Well," Marcus said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I've always been an optimist." He climbed into the pod, extending his hand to help Zara follow. For a moment, she stared at his outstretched palm. A human hand, offering assistance to a Veltar. Her father would have taken it without hesitation. Her father had always believed that understanding could bridge any gap between species. Her father had died believing in human promises. But, as another explosion shook the station and pieces of debris began to pepper the outer hull, Zara realized she had run out of alternatives. She grasped Marcus Chin's hand and allowed him to help her into the pod. The hatch sealed with a soft hiss, and the pod's internal systems came online with a series of soft chimes. Zara strapped herself into one of the acceleration couches, acutely aware of the humans surrounding her. In the confined space, their alien scents and sounds seemed amplified, reminding her of everything that separated her from them. The pod detached from the station with a gentle jolt, and, through the small viewport, Zara watched as Kepler 7 fell away beneath them. The massive structure looked like a wounded giant, sections of it dark and twisted, others still glowing with the fires that were consuming it from within. She had spent 3 months aboard that station, longer than she had stayed anywhere since leaving her homeworld, and now it was dying. "Rescue beacon is active," announced the pod's pilot, a middle-aged man whose hands were steady on the controls despite the circumstances. "Now we wait." Zara closed her eyes and tried not to think about the failing life support systems, about the 12 hours that stood between them, and slow suffocation. Instead, she found herself remembering her father's words from long ago, spoken in the harmonic language of their people as they walked among the crystal gardens of their homeworld. "The universe is vast, little song," he had said, using the pet name he had given her as a child. "In all that vastness, there must be room for understanding between all thinking beings." We must never lose hope that strangers can become friends, that enemies can become allies. At the time, she had believed him. Now, trapped in a failing escape pod with the very species that had destroyed her world and killed her father, Zara wondered if hope was just another word for foolishness. The pod drifted away from the dying station, carrying its 10 passengers into the cold embrace of space, where time moved differently, and every breath counted. Behind them, Kepler 7 continued its spectacular death, lighting up the darkness with fire and fury. Ahead lay only the vast unknown, and the question of whether 12 hours would be enough time for rescue to arrive, or whether it would be enough time for a Veltar engineer to finally understand what humans were truly capable of when everything they valued hung in the balance. The escape pod drifted through the void like a metal seed cast into an infinite garden of stars. Inside the cramped confines, 10 beings tried to make themselves as small as possible while the reality of their situation slowly sank in. The initial relief of escaping the dying station had given way to a more sobering understanding. They had traded certain death for probable death, buying themselves perhaps 12 hours to hope for a miracle. Zara sat in the corner acceleration couch, her crystalline blue skin reflecting the soft glow of the pod's emergency lighting. She had drawn her knees up to her chest, making herself as compact as possible, acutely aware that every movement, every breath, was a drain on their precious life support reserves. Around her, the humans settled into their own coping mechanisms. Some talked in hushed voices, others stared out the small viewport at the stars, and a few had closed their eyes as if they could will themselves into a sleep that might make the waiting easier. The pod's pilot, who had introduced himself as Captain Rodriguez, was running diagnostics on their systems with methodical precision. His fingers moved across the control surfaces with practiced ease, but Zara could see the tension in his shoulders, the tight set of his jaw as the readouts confirmed what they all suspected. They were alive, but not for long. Life support is holding steady for now, Rodriguez announced to the group. Atmospheric recyclers are functioning at 60% efficiency. Oxygen reserves are adequate for approximately 11 hours and 43 minutes. A woman named Sarah, who worked in the station's communications department, let out a shaky laugh. 11 hours. That's not very long, is it? Long enough, said an older man named Peterson, though his voice lacked conviction. The rescue ships will find us. The beacon is transmitting our coordinates every 30 seconds. Marcus Chun, who sat directly across from Zara, was studying a handheld diagnostic unit he had pulled from his equipment pack. His dark eyes moved across the small screen with the same analytical focus she had noticed during the evacuation. There was something oddly comforting about his calm demeanor, even if she didn't trust the motives behind it. Dr. Chun, Rodriguez called from the pilot station. Your thoughts on our situation? Marcus looked up from his device, his expression thoughtful. The beacon is functioning correctly, and we're well within the search corridor that rescue operations will establish. The primary concern isn't whether they'll find us, but whether they'll find us in time. A young technician named Webb shifted nervously in his seat. How long until the rescue ships arrive? Really? Rodriguez consulted his navigation display. Best case scenario, based on our last communication with the nearest patrol ship, is 18 hours. Worst case. He shrugged, the gesture speaking volumes about possibilities no one wanted to voice. Zara watched the interplay between the humans with professional interest. In her 3 years of working in human space, she had observed that their species exhibited remarkably consistent behavior patterns under stress. They sought reassurance from authority figures, formed impromptu social hierarchies based on perceived expertise, and engaged in what her xenopsychology textbooks called collective optimism maintenance, essentially lying to themselves and each other to preserve morale. What she had not expected was to find herself the subject of curious, but not hostile attention. Several of the humans kept glancing in her direction, but their expressions seemed more fascinated than fearful. It was unusual. You're Veltar, said the communications officer, Sarah, turning to address Zara directly. I've never met one of your people before. Are you really from the crystalline worlds? Zara considered not answering. Engaging in conversation with humans had rarely ended well for her in the past. But, confined as they were, silence might be more uncomfortable than speech. Yes, she replied, her harmonically complex voice carrying easily in the small space. I am from Veltar Prime. What's it like? Asked Webb, his earlier nervousness apparently overcome by curiosity. I've seen the holos, but they say those don't really capture the singing of the crystals? For a moment, Zara was transported back to her homeworld, to the vast crystal gardens that had once covered continents in geometric perfection. She remembered the sound they made when the wind moved through them, a harmony that spoke to something deep in Veltar souls, a music that had inspired her people's greatest art and philosophy. She also remembered the silence that had followed the human mining operations, the dead zones where nothing sang anymore, because nothing lived. The crystals do not sing anymore, she said quietly. Your people made sure of that. An uncomfortable silence fell over the pod. Zara immediately regretted her words, not because they weren't true, but because they served no purpose in their current situation. Personal grievances seemed petty when measured against the vast indifference of space, and the steady countdown of their oxygen reserves. Marcus Chen leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. I'm sorry for what happened to your world. What my species did there, it wasn't right. Zara stared at him, momentarily stunned. In 3 years of working alongside humans, no one had ever acknowledged the devastation of Veltar Prime, much less apologized for it. Most seemed to regard it as ancient history, or worse, as a necessary cost of galactic development. You know what happened? She asked. I made it my business to know, Marcus replied. Before I came to work in Veltar space, I studied your people's history. The crystal gardens of your homeworld were one of the most sophisticated biotechnological systems in the galaxy. They took your ancestors thousands of years to cultivate. 15,000 years, Zara corrected softly. And they were destroyed in 15 months of strip mining. Marcus's voice carried a note of genuine regret. It was cultural genocide, disguised as economic development. Peterson, the older man, shifted uncomfortably. Now look, that's a pretty harsh way to put it. The mining operations brought jobs, infrastructure, technology transfer. They brought death, Zara said, her voice hardening. They brought poison that killed our crystal singers, toxins that turned our gardens to ash, machines that carved up our ancestral sites like they were meaningless rock formations. But surely your people benefited from contact with galactic civilization, Sarah interjected, her tone suggesting she genuinely believed this. Access to advanced technology, medical advances, expanded trade opportunities. Zara felt the familiar anger rising in her chest, the same fury that had driven her to leave her homeworld and seek work in the frontier colonies where questions about her past were rarely asked. These humans, sitting in their failing escape pod, were still defending the systematic destruction of her world as if it had been a favor to her people. My father died from exposure to human industrial chemicals, she said, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones that indicated deep emotion in her species. He was a crystal singer, one of the keepers of our oldest traditions. When your people came, he welcomed them. He believed that two species could work together, could learn from each other. She paused, remembering her father's final days, the way his voice had become rough and broken, no longer able to produce the pure tones that made the crystals respond. He died believing that understanding was possible between our kinds. I have seen little evidence that he was correct. The pod fell silent again, but this time the quiet was thick with tension rather than simple discomfort. Zara realized she had probably destroyed any chance of maintaining civil relations with her fellow survivors, but found she didn't particularly care. If they were all going to die in this metal coffin, she saw no reason to pretend that their species had been anything other than a plague upon her people. Marcus Chun was the first to break the silence. Your father sounds like he was a wise man, and perhaps more right than you think. How can you say that? Zara demanded. Look what your people have done. Look what they continue to do. Some humans, Marcus said carefully, have done terrible things to your people. But not all humans. Just as I imagine not all Veltar are the same. The ones who destroyed my world were following orders from their government, their corporations, their military. They had the support of their entire civilization. Did they? Marcus asked. Or did they have the support of the people who stood to profit from the destruction? Zara was about to respond when Rodriguez called out from the pilot station. I'm picking up something on sensors. Debris field, about 2 kilometers off our port side. The conversation about Veltar Prime was immediately forgotten as everyone turned their attention to the viewport. In the distance, they could see the twisted remains of what had once been part of Kepler 7. Sections of hull plating tumbled slowly end over end, catching and reflecting starlight as they spun. Any survivors? Sarah asked. Rodriguez studied his sensors for several minutes before shaking his head. No life signs, just wreckage. The sight of the debris served as a stark reminder of their own mortality. They had escaped the immediate destruction of the station, but they were still very much in danger. The pod's life support systems continued their quiet work, scrubbing carbon dioxide from the air and rationing oxygen with mechanical precision. But the countdown was inexorable. Webb pulled out a small personal communicator and activated its chronometer function. 10 hours and 18 minutes, he announced to no one in particular. Don't do that, Peterson said sharply. Watching the clock won't help anything. Neither will pretending we have unlimited time, Webb shot back. The stress was beginning to show. Zara had observed enough human behavior to recognize the signs: shortened tempers, increased irritability, the tendency to snap at each other over trivial matters. It was a predictable response to a life-threatening situation, but that didn't make it any less dangerous in their confined quarters. Marcus Chin seemed to recognize the same signs. We need to establish some protocols, he said in his calm, measured voice. Guidelines for how we're going to manage the next several hours. What kind of protocols? Rodriguez asked. Conservation of movement to reduce oxygen consumption. Organized rest periods to maintain mental acuity. Maybe some structured activities to keep everyone focused on something other than our situation. Sarah laughed bitterly. Activities? What are we, children at summer camp? No, Marcus replied without taking offense. We're 10 intelligent beings who need to work together if we're going to maximize our chances of survival. Panic and despair are luxuries we can't afford. Despite herself, Zara found herself nodding in agreement. The human xenobiologist was demonstrating exactly the kind of rational thinking that the situation required. It annoyed her to discover that he was capable of such clear analysis under pressure, because it complicated her carefully maintained assumptions about his species. The Veltar engineer is right to agree, Peterson said, noting her gesture. Dr. Chun makes sense. What do you propose? Marcus looked around the pod, his eyes settling momentarily on each of the occupants before speaking. First, we establish a rotation for monitoring our life support systems. Everyone takes a turn, learns how to read the displays. Knowledge reduces anxiety. Second, we organize our resources. Food, water, any equipment that might be useful. Pool everything and inventory it properly. Third, we talk. Not about our situation, but about other things. Our work, our homes, our interests. Human beings are social creatures. We need connection to maintain psychological health. What about her? Webb asked, jerking his head toward Zara. Is she going to participate in your group therapy sessions? The question was asked without malice, but it highlighted the underlying tension that Zara had been feeling since boarding the pod. She was the outsider here, the alien among humans, and now they were all going to be forced into close proximity for what might be the final hours of their lives. Engineer Ketsix is welcome to participate in whatever ways she feels comfortable, Marcus said. But the decision is hers to make. All eyes turned to Zara. She could feel the weight of their attention, the mixture of curiosity and uncertainty in their gazes. Part of her wanted to retreat into silence, to maintain the emotional distance that had served her well during her years in human space. But another part, the part that remembered her father's faith in the possibility of understanding between species, wondered what would happen if she tried a different approach. I will participate, she said finally. But I reserve the right to withdraw if I find the interaction problematic. Fair enough, Marcus said with what might have been the ghost of a smile. And so began what would later be remembered as the strangest conversation of Zara's life. As their escape pod continued its silent journey through the void, 10 survivors began the delicate process of learning to see each other as more than just representatives of their respective species. It was a fragile beginning, built on nothing more solid than shared vulnerability and the universal desire to live. But sometimes, in the cold mathematics of space and time, even fragile beginnings could grow into something stronger. Something that might surprise everyone involved, including a Veltar engineer who had learned not to trust in human promises. The chronometer continued its countdown, but for the first time since boarding the pod, Zara found herself thinking about something other than the failing life support systems. She was thinking about her father, and wondering what he would have made of this unlikely gathering of survivors. Perhaps, she thought, he might have called it hope. The emergency lighting in the pod had dimmed to conserve power, casting long shadows across the faces of the survivors. They had been drifting for 6 hours now, and the initial shock of their escape had given way to the grinding reality of waiting. The life support systems continued their quiet work, but everyone could hear the subtle changes in the air recycling systems. The way the fans seemed to struggle just a little more with each cycle. Marcus Chun had proven to be remarkably effective at organizing their small community. Under his guidance, they had established watches for monitoring their systems, rationed their limited water and emergency rations, and begun the slow process of sharing their stories. It was, Zara had to admit, better than sitting in silence and counting down the hours until their oxygen ran out. Sarah had told them about her work in communications, about the messages she had helped relay between lonely outposts scattered across the frontier. Webb had shared stories of his technical training, his dreams of eventually earning enough to buy passage back to Earth. Even Gruff Peterson had opened up about his years working in asteroid mining, about the dangers and the small victories that kept miners going in the harshest environments humans had ever tried to inhabit. But it was Rodriguez's story that had surprised Zara the most. I wasn't always a pilot, the captain had said during his watch at the controls. 20 years ago, I was a mining foreman. Worked the heavy extraction operations on 3 different worlds. He had paused then, his weathered hand steady on the pod's navigation controls. One of those worlds was Veltar Prime. The admission had fallen into the pod like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of tension that touched everyone present. Zara had felt her breath catch in her throat, her crystalline skin brightening slightly with the bioluminescent response that indicated strong emotion in her species. You were there, she had said, her voice carefully controlled. During the mining operations. I was, Rodriguez had confirmed. I ran a crew of 40 miners. We worked the northern crystal formations, the ones they called the Singing Valleys. Zara knew the Singing Valleys. Her grandmother had taken her there as a child, to walk among the towering crystal formations that had hummed with ancient harmonies. They had been among the most sacred sites on her homeworld, repositories of 15,000 years of Veltar cultural memory. We were told it was uninhabited land, Rodriguez had continued. The corporate surveys said there were no settlements, no active cultivation. We thought we were just mining empty formations. Empty. Zara's voice had carried sharp harmonics of disbelief. The Singing Valleys were home to over 200 crystal gardens. Thousands of my people lived there. Rodriguez had turned in his pilot's seat to face her directly. We never saw them. The corporate overseers said the area had been cleared, that any natives had been relocated to designated zones, with full compensation. Relocated. Zara had tasted the bitter irony of the word. Is that what they called it when they drove my people from lands their families had tended for generations? The conversation had grown heated then, with Peterson defending the mining operations, and Webb arguing that the corporations must have followed proper protocols. Sarah had tried to mediate, suggesting that there might have been miscommunications or misunderstandings. But Marcus Chun had remained silent throughout the exchange, watching Zara with those intelligent brown eyes, as if he was seeing something the others missed. Now, 2 hours later, the tension from that conversation still lingered in the pod's recycled air. Zara sat in her acceleration couch, arms wrapped around her knees, staring out the small viewport at the star field beyond. The view never changed, which she found oddly comforting. In a universe where everything seemed to shift and betray expectations, the steady light of distant suns remained constant. Engineer Keth 6, Marcus said softly, settling into the couch beside hers. May I ask you something? Zara glanced at him, noting that he had waited until the others were occupied with their various tasks before approaching her. Rodriguez was running another diagnostic cycle. Webb and Sarah were sharing a meal pack in quiet conversation, and Peterson was dozing in his seat. You may ask, she replied. I make no promises about answering. Marcus smiled at that, a genuinely amused expression that reached his eyes. Fair enough. I was wondering about your crystal gardens. How did they work exactly? The holos and scientific papers I've read don't really convey the underlying principles. It was not the question Zara had expected. She had thought he might ask about her family, or her experiences with humans, or perhaps her feelings about being trapped with the very species that had destroyed her world. Instead, he wanted to understand her people's greatest achievement. Why do you want to know? She asked. Because from what I've studied, they represent one of the most sophisticated examples of biological engineering in known space. Your people managed to create self-sustaining ecosystems that could exist for thousands of years with minimal intervention. That's remarkable. Zara studied his face, looking for signs of the patronizing curiosity she had encountered from other human scientists. Instead, she saw genuine interest, the expression of someone who appreciated complex systems for their own sake. The gardens were not engineered, she said finally. Not in the way humans understand engineering. They were cultivated, grown through harmonic resonance over many generations. How does that work? Despite herself, Zara found herself warming to the subject. The crystal gardens had been her specialty before the mining operations had destroyed them, and she had spent years studying the intricate relationships between the crystalline formations and the biological systems they supported. Veltar physiology is partially crystalline, she explained.